The manifest listed her as Specimen 11, cargo class biological, status inert, transit origin, the Grey Vault excavation site, Northern Ice Shelf, Kellen's Reach, destination, the Draconic Studies Institute at Vorn, estimated transit time through our depot, 48 hours. She'd been frozen for 3 centuries, they said. Pulled from the glacier intact, sealed in a cryoshell, shipped south on a fast courier that had engine trouble and had to divert to us. We were the last stop before the crossing. A freight depot on the edge of the Dermish Straits, 7 staff, 1 pier, and enough wind to take the paint off the walls. My name is Aldrich's son. I ran manifests, checked seals, moved crates, signed for things nobody else wanted to sign for. I'd done it for 19 years at the Sorvith Depot, and I expected to do it for another 10 before my knees gave out. I was not a man who looked for significance. I had a thermos, a good pair of boots, a stool I'd dragged out of the break room and positioned in Bay 3 because that was the warmest corner of the building. When the nor'easterly came in off the water, that was where they put her. Bay 3, against the south wall. Cryoshell was pale gray composite, taller than a man by half, wider than I could stretch my arms, fogged faintly along the seams where the cold leaked out. The manifest said she was an ancient of the Rime Court, a ruling lineage out of the northern reaches that the excavation team had found entombed in a glacier cave, along with a scatter of relics and a lot of collapsed ice. The accompanying notes used words like preserved specimen and morphological study and estimated age 280 to 330 years post, all of which was the scholar's way of saying, dead thing, very old, ship with care. I signed for her at noon. By 4 in the afternoon, the storm the forecasters had been watching swung north and landed directly on us. The courier that was supposed to pick her up the next morning radioed that it would be 3 days, not 1. Possibly 4, depending on the swell in the straits. The rest of the staff went home to their quarters on the far side of the compound. Our site manager locked the main office and told me to check the seal readings on all the specimens every 6 hours and radio if any of them dropped. Out of range, standard protocol, I told him I would. So I sat in Bay 3 with my thermos and my stool, 6 inches from a crate the size of a wardrobe, and I listened to the storm try to peel the roof off. The readings were fine at 6, fine at midnight. At 2 in the morning I poured the last of the coffee and noticed that the fog on the seams of the cryoshell had changed. It was thicker. The whole shell had a faint, low hum to it that hadn't been there at noon. I checked the panel. All numbers within tolerance. I logged it and sat back down. I don't know why I started talking. Boredom, maybe. Or the storm. There's something about a bad nor'easter that makes silence feel unfriendly. I told her about the depot, about the 19 years, about the season we'd lost half the North Pier to a surge tide and rebuilt it in 3 weeks because the manager at the time, a stubborn woman named Furla Osk, had refused to file an insurance delay and just started hammering. I told her about my wife, Ione, who died 8 years back, and who I still sometimes reached for at night, without thinking. I told her the coffee was gone, and that was probably for the best, because it had been bad coffee. I wasn't expecting an answer. I knew what she was. The manifest was clear enough. At 3:30 the hum deepened. I felt it in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. A low, resonant frequency, like the lowest string on the biggest instrument ever built. The frost crystals on the floor vibrated once. I stood up and looked at the panel, all readings green, but the shell was warm under my palm when I pressed it. Not hot, not alarming, just warm, the way a stone is warm after a day in the sun. I said out loud, I don't know if any of that is getting through. But if it is, you're all right. You're in a freight bay. The storm is just weather. Nobody here is going to bother you, the hum went on. Then it changed. A slight rise at the end. I'm not a fanciful man. I know what ice sounds like when it shifts. I know the noises old metal makes in cold weather. I've worked 19 years moving cargo, and I know when something is listening. I pulled the stool closer and sat back down. Her name was Ione, I said. I mentioned her before. She was a cartographer. She mapped the reef systems off the Dermish Shelf for 22 years. She used to say the ocean kept its secrets the same way a person does. A little at a time, only when it trusted you. I thought that was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about anything. The hums stayed with me, low and steady like company. By morning, the seams had stopped fogging altogether, and the panel showed a temperature reading inside the shell that I didn't report because it was 6 degrees above where it should have been. And I didn't know what that meant. And I didn't want anyone coming in to take her away before the storm. I checked the structural seal. It was fine. She wasn't venting. She was just warmer. 7. I made a fresh pot of the terrible depot coffee, poured a mug, and set it on top of the cryo shell. Not because I thought she could use it. Because Ione always said a hot drink was the first thing you offered anyone who'd been out in the cold for too long. The relief ship arrived on the afternoon of the third day, 40 minutes after the storm cleared. 3 scholars from the Vorn Institute, 2 freight handlers I didn't know, and a man in a gray coat who identified himself as the deputy curator of Draconic Holdings, and who seemed deeply alarmed by my temperature log. He pulled up the panel readings, scrolled back 3 days, and then turned to me and said, very carefully, Mr. Sun, did anything unusual occur during transit? Storm kept her here longer than the manifest said, I told him, and the temperature variance on night 2. Noted and monitored. No structural compromise. Seal integrity confirmed every 6 hours. He looked at me. He looked at the shell, he said. Did you have contact with the specimen? I signed for her, I said. The only one on shift. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, quietly, and to no one in particular, the shell should not have warmed. She has been in cryo-interment for 312 years. The metabolic suppression alone should have. He stopped. He pressed his palm to the side of the shell the same way I had, and he went very still, prepared to move her. I helped them with the freight sling the same as I would for any cargo. 4 bolts, 2 guide rails, easy lift. I stepped back when they started the loading sequence. That was when the seal cracked. Not broke, cracked, a clean line along the primary seam, self-initiated, the way a hatch opens from the inside. The deputy curator made a sound I won't try to describe. The 2 freight handlers stepped back. The scholars froze. I didn't move. The shell opened in sections, and the cold poured out in a white rush of frost and vapor, and through it I saw her enormous and silver pale, her scales the color of old ice, wings folded tight against a body that filled the shell from floor to ceiling. Her eyes were the deep amber of river stones in low water. They opened slowly. They found the room. They found the scholars. They found the deputy curator, who had gone the color of chalk. Then they found me. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she lowered her head, slowly, deliberately, the way something vast does when it chooses to be gentle, until her brow rested on the cold floor of Bay 3, feet from where my stool was still sitting. Nobody spoke. I'm not a man who looks for significance. I didn't that morning either. I just put my hand on the side of her face the way I had on the shell, and I said, the coffee's still terrible, but the storm's gone. All right, she breathed once. A long, quiet exhale, frost and warm air together, and closed her eyes. The deputy curator told me later that she was Cerebus of the Rhyme Court, last of her ruling line, and that there were 14 dragon nations that had believed her dead for 3 centuries, and that the diplomatic implications alone would take years to untangle. He said all of this in a voice that suggested he still hadn't entirely recovered. Told him I was glad she'd had somewhere warm to wait out the storm. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, she bowed to you, Mr. Sun, an ancient of the Rhyme Court. She bowed to a freight handler. I thought about Ione, about the ocean and its secrets, about how long 300 years in the dark must feel, and what it might mean to wake to a voice that wasn't afraid of you and didn't want anything from you and just stayed. People talk too much about rank, I said, not enough about staying. I refilled my thermos, signed the outgoing manifest, and went back to work.